So now we are recording this part of the webinar, just the speakers. And again, when we get to Q&A, we will turn that off. But at this point, I am simply going to hand it off to Randi, who's going to introduce our other speakers, herself, and our topic, which is deep sea conservation. So with that, I'm going to stop my share and hand it over to you, Randi.
Awesome. Thanks, Julie. And hi, everyone. Happy New Year. Um, I think deep sea conservation is a conversation that is ongoing. And I think I'm really excited to have it today, both with our amazing panelists who you're going to meet, Matt and Haydée, but also amongst everyone in the room as everybody starts to think about the new year, marching forward. Last year was a really big change year. 50% of the globe went through an election. Which is a lot, which means that the landscape for conservation has changed a lot too, good, bad, everything in between. So today, I think the goal is to talk about the relationship between policy and science and decision making for conservation, with a little bit of a crystal ball to think about where we might go, but also sort of talk about some capstone projects, some things that people have done in the past, where we are and where we might be headed. So I think that's the goal of today. And with that, I'm really excited to have Matt and Haydée join us. And so I'll introduce Matt first, Matt Gianni, who is the co-founder of the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, who, if you are ready, you can share your slides, but is going to share a bunch of sort of policy and policy advocacy focused conservation perspective with us. Thanks, Matt. Matt, you think you're muted.
There we go.
There
Now
you
I'm
are.
on mute. Yeah. All right. And you can see the screen, I presume.
Yes.
Yep. Okay, good. All right. I'm going to focus primarily on fisheries and give some sense of the, or some kind of a bit of a briefing on the history of deep sea conservation within the global political system, and specifically focused on the high seas, conservation of deep sea ecosystems on the high seas, which really kind of leapt forward to a large extent in the early 2000s with concerns over the question of deep sea trawling on seamounts, cold water corals, and other deep sea so-called vulnerable marine ecosystems. Let me make sure that my arrow is working. Let's see. Hmm. I'm having trouble moving from slide to slide here. There we go. Oops. Okay. So the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition briefly is a coalition of over 130 organizations worldwide, working primarily on international ocean governance, deep sea fisheries, deep sea bed mining, and some new and emerging issues such as marine carbon sequestration. Um, just to give you a kind of a brief, coming back to the introductory comments, let me see if I get rid of this bar across the top of my screen. There we go. I just want to talk to begin with about the United Nations resolutions on managing the impacts of deep sea fisheries in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And this manifests itself, or basically is encapsulated in a series of resolutions adopted by the United Nations General Assembly beginning in 2004, or portions of resolutions in the so-called annual sustainable fisheries resolutions. Boy, my computer is not responding here to slide change. Yeah. So when the coalition came into being in 2004, a number of us actually started working on this in 2001 and 2002. But scientists were raising concern over the impacts of bottom trawl fishing on seamounts predominantly and oceanic ridge systems. Um, and based on a review of the status of the issue or the state of the issue and using 2001 as a baseline year, we came to the conclusion that there were very few, if any, restrictions on where bottom trawl fishing could take place on the high seas, very few restrictions on the catch of deep water species on the high seas as well, with exceptions in the Southern Ocean, managed by the Convention on the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. et cetera. And there were no regional fisheries management organizations that actually could promulgate binding regulations over deep water fisheries on the high seas in the North Pacific, South Pacific, or Indian Ocean, where there were considerable fisheries of this nature occurring in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And so we took the issue to the United Nations General Assembly, basically um, trying to kind of use the effort that I was involved in and some of the others were involved in the late 1980s and early 1990s to put a halt to large-scale high seas drift net fishing, which was an issue that ultimately was resolved through a series of General Assembly resolutions and negotiations. And, scientists were very much a part of that from the beginning, publishing information on the impacts of bottom trawling. Civil society organizations joined with scientists, and by civil society organizations, the network of organizations that were then members of the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, plus others. And we called for a moratorium on bottom trawl fishing on the high seas unless and until it could be managed consistent with international law. And I'll come back to that in a bit. And the debate that occurred at the United Nations General Assembly is similar to the debates about other impacts on deep sea ecosystems in areas beyond national jurisdiction. In this case, it was about sustainable fisheries, but also conservation and protection of biodiversity. The whole idea of equity, where all countries have a right to and a responsibility to have a say in how resource issues or resource extraction and other issues are managed that have an impact on biodiversity and ecosystems on the high seas are of global concern and global responsibility, and not just in the hands of the small number of nations that are actually fishing out there or otherwise extracting resources, and governance and international law. And the the kind of the landmark resolution was Resolution 61-105, adopted in 2006, which basically called for the application of the precautionary and ecosystem approaches to sustainably manage fish stocks and prevent vulnerable marine ecosystems, including seamounts, hydrothermal vents, and cold water corals from destructive fishing practices. And the core agreement was that states would commit to conducting prior environmental impact assessments before bottom fishing was permitted, establish precautionary closures to protect deep sea habitats where so-called vulnerable marine ecosystems are known or likely to occur. And the key phrase likely to occur was very important expression of the precautionary approach, a move-on rule, and ensure sustainable catch and minimize bycatch of other deep sea species. And to adopt and implement these measures by December 31st, 2008, or else stop allowing the bottom fishing to take place on the high seas. And I won't go in reading all this text, but because these will be posted on the website, just wanted to say this call to action was grounded in already existing legal obligations through the second of the implementing agreements of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the so-called 1995 UN Fish Stocks Agreement, which establishes specific obligations in Articles 5 and 6 to prevent overfishing, to assess environmental impacts of fisheries, to protect biodiversity in the marine environment, and to apply the precautionary approach in the management of fisheries on the high seas as well as in areas of national jurisdiction insofar as the management of straddling and highly migratory fish stocks are concerned. And subsequent to the adoption of the 2006 resolution, states entered into a set of negotiations held under the auspices of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization to develop guidelines to basically establish a common understanding of what they meant or what they had agreed to in the 2006 resolution when they called for or committed to conducting impact assessments of bottom fisheries. How do you do that? This was a first. Criteria for identifying vulnerable marine ecosystems and developing criteria for determining whether significant adverse impacts on vulnerable marine ecosystems would likely to occur. And these were incorporated into the UN General Assembly resolution after the deadline of December 31st, 2008, which was the resolution 6472, adopted in 2009, which reinforced the 2006 resolution and endorsed the guidelines as the kind of the criteria for implementing that resolution. And again, the contributions of scientists to this debate were extremely important and critical through a whole range of issues. This is not an exhaustive list. At-sea surveys, raising the issues and concern, publishing papers, contributing to reports, speaking at side events and in plenary sessions of the United Nations Informal Consultative Process on Oceans and the Law of the Sea, which was a kind of a pre session to the actual negotiation of the annual UN General Assembly resolutions. Other sorts of side events and plenary sessions, the conferences of parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, particularly the 2004 meeting, FAO COFI, Committee on Fisheries, and critically, scientists were very much involved, and I didn't put this on the slide, but it was really instrumental in all of this, in the development of the FAO guidelines for the management of deep sea fisheries in the high seas, that I mentioned in the previous slide. Sending statements of concern to the United Nations, influencing individual government positions, and organizing workshops at a variety of different levels, special sessions, etc., at global, regional, and scientific conferences. The good news is that a lot has happened since then. Most of the regional fishery management organizations have incorporated the UNGA resolutions into their bottom fisheries regulations. Some percentage of areas where vulnerable marine ecosystems are known or likely to occur have been closed by most RFMOs. Some have closed much more than others. In the Atlantic, the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization closed all seamounts shallower than 4,000 meters depth to bottom fishing. There have been other specific measures taken that I've mentioned here. The Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources has prohibited all bottom fishing in all high seas, bottom trawl fishing in all high seas areas. And interestingly, 3 new RFMOs have basically been created since 2000, with negotiations beginning in 2006, to manage these types of fisheries on the high seas. And if you look at this map here, those 3 are the North Pacific Fisheries Commission, the South Pacific Regional Fisheries Management Organization, which I think Haydée will discuss in much more detail. It's a very important process going on there, and the South Indian Ocean Fisheries Association. And although this map is not to scale, the reality is most of the high seas were not were simply wide open to any type of bottom or deep water fishing up until the mid 2000s. And that's changed. But there are many shortcomings. I won't go into great detail here, but gaps in the knowledge and the conduct of environmental impact assessments, limited use of seabed surveys and habitat suitability modeling, limited assessment of cumulative impacts, including the extent of the loss of these types of ecosystems by past bottom fishing before the UNGA resolutions kicked in, and before some of these regional fishery management organizations were actually established to begin developing binding regulations to manage these fisheries. There's much more biological information still needed on the species that comprise so-called vulnerable marine ecosystems, life history characteristics, rare endemic species connectivity. Often the regional fishery management organizations ignore one or more of the criteria for identifying so-called vulnerable marine ecosystems in the FAO guideline. There's an ongoing presumption in many cases that where trawling has occurred in the past, there's no need for further protection. The VMEs are already degraded. It ignores the fact that recovery is possible and that a degraded VME may be all the more important to protect in order to facilitate regeneration or recovery of deep water coral ecosystems, for example. You have some of the RFMOs, again, SPREFMO I cite here in this, where the main country doing the trawl fishing on the high seas claims that if it isn't possible to protect all of them, 70% is good enough. Basically making the assumption that virtually every deep water coral ecosystem on seamounts or ocean ridge systems in a biogeographic area are the same species, same composition, same community structures, et cetera, and so forth, which is certainly not the case, and very limited closures in the South Indian Ocean Fisheries Agreement as well. And this just gives you kind of a snapshot of one area. Good news, they've closed all the seamounts, these areas in blue, to bottom fishing. But when it comes to the areas along the continental shelf and slope of the Grand Banks and Flemish Cap out here in the NAFO regulatory area, these red closures, There you can see where, limited numbers of areas where the VMEs are likely to occur have actually been fully closed to bottom fishing. And so there's still a lot that remains to be done there. And can I ask you a quick question? Is this uh, bar, the black bar on the bottom of this screen, my screen,
Nope.
showing in your screen?
Nope, you're good.
Okay, good, good, good. So it's all told, it's a work in progress, and crucially, it's a paradigm shift for the management of fisheries on the high seas. The United Nations General Assembly have committed states, and which have acted on these commitments to greater or lesser degree, to close areas of the high seas to bottom fisheries where VMEs are known or likely to occur unless it can be demonstrated through a prior EIA that bottom fishing can be managed without causing damage to the ecosystem. So rather than the whole of the oceans being open except those areas which are closed on the high seas areas to protect something, in effect, the ANGA has called on states to essentially close the entire high seas at fishable depths to any bottom fishing until you can demonstrate a state or a fishing entity can demonstrate that it is possible to fish in a particular area without doing damage to deep water coral ecosystems, sponge ecosystems, and other types of species and ecosystems that are vulnerable to the impacts of that type of fishing. It hasn't been fully and effectively implemented, but if and when it can be, and it should serve as a precedent for managing other types of fisheries and other types of activities in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Uh, and I'm still trying to go down here. Okay, and I'll skip on this, but in addition to the closures that have been done to date, we estimate about half to two-thirds of the high seas at fishable depths are either closed to bottom fisheries, formally closed, or provisionally closed to bottom fisheries. And there's been a substantial decrease in the number of vessels that are actually doing the bottom trawl fishing in particular on the high seas, bottom trawling being the main type of gear used to fish deep water species in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And I would just refer you to this, maybe come back to the to look at this later when it's online. But the UN World Ocean Assessment, in the first World Ocean Assessment, highlighted real concerns over the impact of fishing on seamounts and other underwater features, and have talked about the fact that the fishing has degraded these ecosystems to such an extent that has, well, listen here, presumably reduced their ecological and evolutionary resilience as a result of reduced reproductive potential and loss of genetic diversity and ecological connectivity. The second Ocean System and World Ocean Assessment, rather, in 2021 was a little bit more blunt. Fishing, especially bottom trawling, constitutes the greatest current threat to seamount ecosystems. So still, after all the activity, all the policy, the obligations in international law, there is still a problem here. And it's one that a number of us, Coral Reefs to High Seas, the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, Blue Nature Alliance, and others are now kind of ramping up our efforts to try to finalize or push this to a successful conclusion, and in so doing, hopefully serve some precedents for effective implementation of the BBNJ agreement and other initiatives that have emerged over the past couple decades. And again, one of the key initiatives is halting and reversing biodiversity loss. This is in the Global Biodiversity Framework of the Convention on Biological Diversity's COP15, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. It's in the Leaders' Pledge, adopted or open for signature in 2021 by the UN Secretary General. It goes all the way back to, in fact, the World Summit on Sustainable Development commitments and the commitments from the Rio Plus 20 conference in 2012, and others. And with that in mind, we have a process to try to correct the problem that began in the 1960s and 1970s and 1950s, really, with some of the first factory trawlers going out well offshore and fishing deep on seamounts for species such as splendid alfonsino and pelagic armorhead in the North Pacific, round-nosed grenadier in the Northeast and Northwest Atlantic, etc. But we now have a new and emerging issue, which is, well, not so new, but an emerging issue, which is deep sea bed mining. And I think many of you have heard the news on this, and there's gotten a lot of play, so we won't, in the press and in political circles and so forth, so I won't go into great detail here. But just to note that again, coming back to international law, there are some very clear obligations in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea for the management of deep sea mining in areas beyond national jurisdiction, the so-called area, including Article 140. Activities in the area shall be carried out for the benefit of mankind as a whole. And critically, Article 145, which states that necessary measures shall be taken to ensure effective protection for the marine environment from harmful effects of seabed mining related activities and the prevention of damage to the flora and fauna of the marine environment. And let me just move this bar here. Well, anyway. So, again, boy, I think my computer is freezing up on me here. My apologies here.
Okay, we can still hear you, Matt.
Yeah, okay, maybe I should put, yeah. No, my slides aren't changing, unfortunately. Okay, here we go. So the potential scale of the mining, as I think many of you are aware, is quite large. Just using the Clarion-Clipperton zone as an example, the area of greatest interest for commercial mining, for nodules in this case, cobalt, copper, nickel, and manganese. The scale is huge. And you can see the comparison to the North American continent. And of course, scientists are warning that the mining at the scale envisioned and with the technology currently available is likely to cause widespread and irreversible damage to deep sea ecosystems in the area, including the potential for species extinction of species that haven't even yet been discovered. And I heard some of this on the chat just before the presentation here. So again, we have the political context, 2025, it should say. We have the new UNCLOS implementing agreement, which is moving the needle forward in terms of protection and biodiversity conservation in areas beyond national jurisdiction, and again, serving as a precedent or a blueprint for overall marine environmental protection. And just to quote one article that talks about the approach of the treaty is designed to build ecosystem resilience, including the adverse effects of climate change and ocean acidification, and also maintain and restore ecosystem integrity, including the carbon cycling services that underpin the role of the ocean in climate. And so you have, in the case of the BBNJ versus ISA negotiations to open up the deep ocean to mining, the exploitation negotiations, a tale of two instruments, a kind of a riff on the tale of two cities. You know, on the one hand, an UNCLOS implementing agreement for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, which embodies the precautionary principle, an ecosystem approach, etc. And on the other hand, states negotiating a new instrument under UNCLOS, the ISA mining code, or the exploitation regulations that may well lead to biodiversity loss in deep sea systems already under stress from climate change related impacts, pollutions, plastics, and other anthropogenic impacts. So again, coming back to the international approach to managing bottom fisheries on the high seas, the BBNJ agreement should help foster a coherent, coordinated approach to the conservation of marine biological diversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, amongst whether bottom fisheries, deep sea fisheries, regulating mining-related activities, including exploration activities. And then additional, you have the kind of the backdrop of growing commitments to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, protect and restore the health, productivity, and resilience of oceans. Again, I mentioned some of these before, Rio Plus 20, Leaders Pledge, etc., the Sustainable Development Goals, and so forth. And looking forward now, there are opportunities both to further consolidate the implementation of the General Assembly resolutions and the political commitments and legal obligations that high seas fishing nations have undertaken, but also to work to prevent damage to the deep sea from deep sea bed mining, and to apply to other new and emerging issues such as geoengineering, in particular, marine carbon sequestration or carbon MCDR. Now I forgot what what it stands for here.
Marine carbon dioxide removal.
There we go. There we go. Thank you. Thank you, Randy. But we have the UN Ocean Conference in 2025, the UNGA new review again of the implementation of the bottom fisheries resolutions in 2026, all of the annual meetings of regional fishery management organizations, the ISA and the UNFCCC, the BB&J agreement, not only the preparatory meetings coming up, but also the conferences of parties and the various the legal architecture that will be established once that agreement enters into force, the CBD conferences of parties and so forth. And let me just end with, I love this quote, courtesy of Elizabeth Colbert and her book, The Sixth Extinction, but she quotes John Alroy in a paper he published in Science in 2001, I think. I can't see the bottom of my screen. But he called the end Pleistocene megafauna mass extinction as a geological instantaneous ecological catastrophe that was too gradual to be perceived by the people who unleashed it. Well, we no longer have that excuse. Ignorance is no longer excuse. The precautionary approach, the international law, etc. And, with the understanding that we are in the midst of one of the great extinction spasms of geological history, according to E.O. Wilson, and the IPBES reports raising concern that a million species are at risk of extinction, many in the next few decades. So I'll end with that. Thank you very much, and back over to you, Randi.
Matt, it's so amazing to see sort of the past, present, and future of where we are. And to kind of get that overview, I think it's going to be critical for the discussion to follow. So before I introduce our next speaker, I just want to just let everyone know some questions have come up in the chat privately to me. That's totally fine. If you have questions for any of the speakers, you can hold them. You can put them in the chat to me. You can put them in the chat to everyone. You can put them in the chat to Julie or Rosalind. Or any of the other COBRA co-Is. I think Beth, Jeff, and Andy might be here. And we will all make sure that your question gets seen and heard. So if you think of it now and you can't hold it, just put it in the chat to one of us and we'll make sure it gets asked at the end. And so with that, we have so many questions for Matt already, but I am going to give Haydée Rodríguez-Romero the floor. Haydée, I just had the pleasure of meeting in person for the first time in Costa Rica, which was so incredibly wonderful. And Haydée is the director of the Coral Reefs of the High Seas Coalition, which is run in partnership with Conservation International. So Haydée, I am going to turn it over to you to run your slides and talk to us.
Thank you, Randi. And thank you for this invitation. I'm really thrilled to share this with you. I think now you're seeing my screen, hopefully.
Yep, that looks great. Yeah, that looks good.
Thank you. So yes, I have different hats, but today I'm coming with my Coral Reefs of the High Seas Coalition hat. And I want to talk about Costa Rica and the deep sea from the perspective of how we are understanding the marine environment in Costa Rica and the deep sea in the last years, but also under the umbrella of what it's next. How are we going to harmonize the national and the international regulations for the conservation of the deep sea? And after having this great conversation with Randi in Costa Rica, I realized that I know just like a small part of what is the deep sea. And I have been working with the deep sea without even like realizing the impact of protecting the deep sea here in Costa Rica, because I'm going to tell you this story. But before we get there, I want to also explain what is the Coral Reefs of the High Seas Coalition very briefly. So this is it's a partnership, a voluntary partnership that came together in 2019 with the desire of bringing the high seas or the areas beyond national jurisdictions to the people. So at that moment, what we envisioned was to have the idea of the corals as we know them in shallow waters or in the coastal areas, and bring that idea into the people to have a closer look to the high seas. So how can we identify with something that we know? And then realize how different is an ecosystem when we change salinity, pressure, temperature in the deep seas. So the Coral Reefs of the High Seas Coalition is working in different sites, and we have prioritized different sites to work toward the protection of coral reefs ecosystems in the high seas. But we are now working in Salas Gomez and Nazca, which is two ridges in front of Peru and Chile in South America. And these are also, and now I understand why we were talking about that bar, Matt, before. So
we can't see it, Haydée, just so you know.
Yes, but it's right in the middle of my screen, so it's kind of like, but it's fine. Thank you. So we are focusing in Salas Gomez and Nazca, and this is a deep sea area, right? These ridges has an average of depth of 2,100 meters, with most of the ridge ranging in depth between 2,000 and 2,500 meters. So we are working there, and I'm not going to tell you more about our work in Salas Gomez and Nazca, but because Matt made the reference to our work with the RFMO in the area, I'm going to tell you that we are promoting a fishery closure in the area so we can protect the whole water column and the deep sea as well, in terms of the seamounts of these ridges, through the RFMO, hopefully by 2026. And in the meanwhile, because we know that at this point we don't have a biodiversity agreement for protecting the high seas, we are still in the making of the ratifications for this agreement. We want to set the whole stage for when this agreement is going to be ready to be implemented and enforced. So right now, the idea is to start working with these RFMO, creating awareness, bringing information about the deep sea, the ridges, the coral reefs in the area, and why it's important to protect it. So when the BBNJ agreement enter into force, we will be ready with one stakeholder on board, hopefully. So, okay. I born in Costa Rica, and when I grew up, this is the map that they taught me in school. A small country in the middle of the American continent with 51,000 square kilometers. And it was until 5 years ago when we start talking about the big Costa Rica and how we look Costa Rica from a different perspective, the marine perspective. And now my kid has been taught that the real size of Costa Rica is 589 square kilometers. So it's really different, the vision that I had as a kid of a really small Costa Rica, knowing that now my kid has the vision of a big Costa Rica surrounded by water. And now he understands that Costa Rica is predominantly a marine country, and the extension that covers the ocean is 91.4% of the national territory. And from that 91.4%, it is estimated that 80% is located below 1,500 meters above sea level. So we are talking about a big Costa Rica that is a deep Costa Rica as well. And this is something that we will need to move forward as well. We need to understand how big we are in terms also about the extension and the deep of our country. So although we are a country that has this remarkable biodiversity and deep sea life, it was until 20 years ago that we started actually talking about all the spaces that we don't know in the ocean, in our economic exclusive zone, especially around Cocos Island. And I think Cocos Island, 500 kilometers away from the coast in Costa Rica, takes 34 hours to get there in a vessel, is probably the most emblematic island and space in the country, and the bridge between all that we know about the land and what we don't know about the ocean. So how did Costa Rica started protecting the deep sea? We did it by understanding the importance of the seamounts and the seamount chain that was connecting Cocos Island with the coastal area of Costa Rica in 2018, when we started a real process for expanding the marine protected areas in Costa Rica around Cocos Island to have a marine management area with one very specific and interesting objective, among others, that is like the seamounts for this marine protected area as a conservation objective. So although the Cocos Island was established as a national park since the 70s, it was until 2015, 2018 that we started a real process from the policy perspective to establish a conservation for these seamounts as deep sea ecosystems. And it was not an easy process. And when I was at the beginning of this webinar talking with my small group, I realized we have a lot of concerns about how to translate science to policymakers. But we cannot forget that in the middle, we have also communities that need to understand and to share their knowledge as well with us. So we should be aware of how to translate that science to the decision makers in very participatory processes. So we will need to be able to talk in the future to different audiences for different objectives. And in this case, for the Cocos Island, knowing that we wanted to protect this part of the seamounts, we had a lot of difficulties in the making of the executive decree for the protection. We knew that the only way that we wanted to set a precedent about the expansion of this protected area towards the seamount was needed to do it thinking about how to protect this from future threats like deep sea mining, how we can protect this from bottom trawling fishing for shrimp, how we can protect this from pollution. And some of the images that expeditions have of these areas even show plastic in the areas. So we use all this narrative and data around climate change, bottom trawling, deep sea mining, and the connection between the whole water column and the deep sea to make the case to protect this part of the seamounts around the Cocos Island. We also made the case about the cumulative impacts of all these combined effects on the ocean. But I think the challenges came from the fishing industry mainly, And we had even challenges at the Constitutional Court that ended last year when they rejected these challenges, and they stated that the creation of this marine protected area was legal and was needed for the environment. So I know that from my perspective, when I see these images from the Smith Ocean Institute and the Falkor, one of their many expeditions around the seamounts and the deep sea in Costa Rica, I learned some of the names, the scientific names for these species, and I forgot them very quickly. But what stays with me is when I see these images is how amazing, beautiful, how many things are in the deep sea of Costa Rica that we really don't know. But most importantly, what is in my mind in this moment is how can we translate that into regulation? What kind of institutions are behind the protection of this? Where are the gaps in conservation and the implementation of regulations in the courts or just like in the executive branch? So I think we need a more integrated management. In Costa Rica, we don't have at this point many references about the deep sea in Costa Rica in our regulation. And then we are having some international we have international commitments that we need to put in practice, but without really having national regulations to protect the deep sea, we are going nowhere. How we can get this holistic approach, how we can collaborate between the government, with the scientists, with the stakeholders. And I know that expanding this MPA around Cocos Island, protecting the seamounts, is crucial for protecting deep sea habitats. But how we are going to make this an effective management system? At this point, we still don't have a management plan for the area approved. There is a long process to establish that, and then we will need to enforce that management plan. And we will need to have technology to monitor, and we will need to have funds to make this a real marine protected area in the future. And with this, I'm going to end here, just thinking out loud about the importance of investing in deep sea research in countries like Costa Rica, for example, and how to translate that and incorporate community and community knowledge into this. The difference between having only scientists exploring the deep sea and having also representatives from the communities seeing with their own eyes what is below the water, that can make a huge difference, even in terms of how to do the advocacy with the public sector. And we also need to strengthen the international cooperation. And I really want to see the BBNJ agreement in the future being this connecting tissue between the national and the international cooperation, and how international framework and bodies are working with the governments in the future. So I think there is a lot to do in terms of protection for Costa Rica. We did a big step. We took a big step towards the conservation of the deep sea when we established this marine protected area around Cocos Island to protect the seamounts. But there is still much to do, and there are still gaps that needs to be addressed in the national regulation and to be connected with international responsibilities as well. So thank you very much.
Amazing. I love that you're leaving us on these beautiful images to sort of think through. It's um, completely, completely beautiful. And I have the very awkward transition of now introducing myself. But I'm actually really thrilled, even though it's you, both of you are a very hard act to follow. I am very thrilled to be able to sort of maybe give us a case study about where sort of where I've started thinking about deep sea conservation and sort of where it's leading now. And I think these three stories sort of, or three speakers sort of will all knit together, and I'll try to be quick so I can leave us some room for, more conversation. It's always the screen sharing fun. Let me see if I can do this and avoid the black bar. So can you see my slides
Yep, you did it.
Yes.
not in presenter mode? Oh,
Perfect.
amazing. Okay. So I am here, like all of us, right? Because I'm pretty interested in deep sea ecosystems, but I am speaking to you today with three hats. This is my mode of self-introduction. So I'm one of the COBRA co-Is, and I help to lead the master class, which is starting in a week. And I'm really excited. There's some past, present, and maybe some future fellows here with us. But I'm also the lead scientist for the Blue Nature Alliance, and I'll explain a little bit about that organization and how we work. And I am the former co-chief scientist of the Phoenix Islands Protected Area, which I co-led with Torika Tamari from the Republic of Kiribati. And through all of these sort of hats, I have had firsthand experience with the joys and the challenges of large-scale ocean conservation in deep sea ecosystems. So in the very famous words of Jacques Cousteau, people protect what they love, but they love only what they know. And of course, in the deep sea, there are just so many unknowns. It gets better literally every day and every dive. But because there have been so many unknowns, I should say, it's sometimes hard to raise the profile of the deep sea in conservation. Like Haydée just said, those images are absolutely motivating, but when you don't know what's there, it's very hard to motivate protections throughout the water column and at the seafloor. But if you look at the map of large-scale marine protected areas across the globe, which is always out of date instantly, so this is just a recent map, it's almost easy. It's almost easy to think that it's easy, right? That protecting the deep sea, making marine protected areas is a foregone conclusion. I mean, after all of these MPAs have basically been created within the past 2 decades, and most of them include a large portion of the deep sea inside of them. And so I want to tell you a little bit about how hard it was to create the enabling conditions for deep sea protection with a little focus on this MPA here, the Phoenix Islands Protected Area. So the Phoenix Islands Protected Area, called PIPA for short, is in the Republic of Kiribati, and it was one of the first large-scale MPAs in the world. And it was certainly the first to be created by a small island but large ocean developing state. And it was envisioned in the early 2000s, and it successfully went through phase 1 protections in 2006 and became the largest and deepest UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2010. I joined the project 2 years before that in 2008, helping to build their science program and advocate for World Heritage status protections. And for those of you who know the story of PIPA already, you know that at the time that it was created, it was almost heretical. There were just no large-scale MPAs of comparable size and depth that yet existed. Basically, PIPA and Papahanaumokuakea came online at the same time, followed quickly by Chagos. And together, these 3 MPAs paved the way for much of the deep sea marine protected areas and large-scale marine protected areas that followed. Of course, it's now 2025, which is kind of unbelievable. Happy New Year. And I think we have a long way to go. We're all trying to race towards 30 by 30. If you are unfamiliar with this, it's the idea of trying to protect 30% of lands and waters by the year 2030. But as of last month, here's where we were, right? These are the current numbers as published on the MPA Atlas website. 2.9% of the ocean is fully or highly protected, and 8.3% of the ocean has partial protections. I mean, this is a long road to climb, and we have basically 5 years to do it. So how are we going to reach 30% in time? Enter the Blue Nature Alliance, which is one group of many who are helping to achieve this goal. There are many, many partners and organizations across the globe who are all, focused on this global initiative. But the specific goal of the Blue Nature Alliance is to work with partners to accelerate the pace, scale, and effectiveness of ocean conservation. And the reason you may not have heard of us before is that we're an ephemeral institution, right? We were formed just a few years ago, and it's like one of these partnerships of partnerships, where the 5 key partners, Conservation International, Pew, Minderoo, the Walton Foundation, and the Jeff, came together with a goal of trying to advance ocean protection to the tune of 5% in about 5 years. So the idea was to try to double the amount of fully and highly protected ocean area, basically going from 2.5% to 5%, so basically double that, 5% in 5 years. COVID slowed us down a little bit, but the basic goal is to get 18 million square kilometers of ocean protected. And through partnership, we've made a lot of progress to date, which is very exciting, although there's a long way to go. So for example, I'll draw your attention to the top, where there's 21.9 million square kilometers of ocean where we partner, although not all of that has had increased protections, improved protections, or increased efficacy of protections. But there's a lot of lessons learned as we work globally across 39 plus site engagements. Every time I show this map, somebody from the Alliance who might be on this call is going to tell me it's instantly out of date, because it always is. But there's a massive amount of countries. 39 site engagements basically means 39 countries, 39 political administrations, 39 campaigns, 39 plus groups of partners who are all working together towards ocean conservation. But one thing that we have learned over the years, the short years, as we have basically pushed hard to try to enable conservation, a lot of which has been in the deep sea, is that we've had to embrace a singular philosophy called the conservation journey. And this idea is that MPAs naturally have peaks and valleys along their path. And one critical piece that is consistent throughout everything in the conservation journey is constituency building, which you can see along the bottom, which both Matt and Haydée touched upon, right? The importance of trying to bring everyone along on this journey, no matter where you are on it. And I will say that this is especially important and especially hard in the deep sea, where despite all of the incredible mapping, exploration, and science that's been happening over the past decade, 2 decades really, there's still a lot of unfamiliarity. So how to build constituency, right, when you're basically trying to help people fall in love with what they may not yet know. And so, of course, once you know something, right, you're most likely to be smitten. Personally, I'm partial to deep sea corals. I know there's a lot of deep sea love in this crowd. You can pick your favorite organism or ecosystem, right? Once you're in it, you're all the way smitten. But back in the day, we just didn't know very much. In the Phoenix Islands protected area, the first deep water expedition was in 2017. And this was work that was brought together by the NOAA Office of Ocean Exploration and the Schmidt Ocean Institute, and had a huge number of people contribute to make it happen. Eric Cordes, Tim Schenk, Brian Kennedy, Steve Auskovich, Amanda Demopoulos, Chris Kelly, Derek Sowers, Ambassador Sito, Tukubutera Roko. I mean, the list is endless, right, of all of the people who came together to make these first 2 expeditions happen. So we got our first glimpse of the deep sea in the Phoenix Islands protected area in 2017. And that was more than a decade after the inception of the protected area. And it was 2 years after the deep sea was fully protected. So essentially, the importance of the deep sea wasn't known until after the fact, and had to be justified continually after protections, which was, again, this is the challenge of being one of the first ones to do this. We had to build the plane, fly the plane as we build it, build the plane as we fly it, whatever. We had to figure it out and start protections using precautionary principle without fully understanding what we were protecting. So now moving right, seeing the deep sea after it's protected, we did a bunch of things to help justify continued protections of the deep sea. So for example, after these first few large asset expeditions, we tried to bring the deep sea to inhabited parts of the country via workshops and drop cams, which met with some exciting success, and the first deep water images from Tarawa, the capital of Kiribati. We rounded with community groups and schools to share deep sea imagery and stories. And this is a photo taken by Brian Kennedy, who I think is on the call, which is one of my favorites ever. We made some surprising and inadvertent deep sea discoveries, which led to some inventions and some papers, which led to the first patent ever for the Republic of Kiribati. And this patent is still, as of yet, unlicensed, but the process of going through the patenting and patenting a co-invention with the country and making them the lead inventor on the patent was an opportunity to pave the path for equitable partnerships on intellectual property moving forward. Should anyone ever want to license and use this invention, the Republic of Kiribati will be safeguarded and their interests are protected. And this was a direct benefit of the deep sea. But despite the so many benefits of the deep sea, these, and of course, many, many more, which many of you on the call could articulate, we learned, if you know the story of Pippa, that conservation is not a foregone conclusion. I mean, I love to think of the conservation journey as a forward movement, but sometimes it goes back on itself, and we hope that it will move forward in the future. And so deep sea conservation remains a challenge, and the need for constituency building still very much remains. So let me just fast forward a little bit back here to the next 5 years and what's coming. This is the current landscape of marine protected areas and the work of the Blue Nature Alliance and many others around the globe. There are still so many deep water MPAs forming, and there are hopes for many high seas MPAs, as both Matt and Haydée, articulated. But today, the conversation that I'm hoping we'll have a little bit of time to have is about how to better enable deep sea protections going forward, discuss what's working or maybe what's not working as we all strive to reach 3030. So how do we do it? How do we best enable deep sea conservation? How do we better translate our research for all stakeholders? If we peer into our crystal ball, what's the next step? And so with that, I have the awkward and but wonderful joy and challenge of now pivoting our conversation from presentation mode to Q&A to hear from Matt and Haydée and hopefully all of you about thoughts for deep sea conservation. I want to hear success stories. I want to hear how we stave against failure. And most importantly, I want to know how we do this. How do we propel ourselves to 30 by 30 and even go beyond? So with that, I will stop sharing and say thank you.